afternoon. Thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Elizabeth Siegel, and I'm the Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before turning to the content of the webinar today, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar is going to work, and then take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about the National Reentry Resource Center. Anytime during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We'll keep a running list of the content-related questions that we receive, and then ask presenters to respond to the questions during the last segment of the webinar. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter technical or audio problems during the webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we're recording this event and we'll post it on our website at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. We should have the webinar posted online early next week, and once it's been posted, we'll email you a link to the recording. The Second Chance Act, which was signed into law in 2008, is the first federal legislation passed by Congress to authorize federal support for reentry programs. The bill authorized up to $165 million in federal grants to state, local, and tribal government agencies and nonprofit organizations. Recognizing how complex reentry initiatives are and the importance of integrating research and evidence into those initiatives, the Second Chance Act authorized the creation of a National Resource Center for Adult and Juvenile Reentry. In 2009, following a competitive process, the Council of State Governments Justice Center was selected to launch the National Reentry Resource Center and provide training and technical assistance to all other Second Chance Act grantees. The National Reentry Resource Center is administered by the Council of State Governments Justice Center in partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice. Since 2009, nearly 600 Second Chance Act grant awards have been made to government agencies and nonprofit organizations from 49 states for reentry programs serving adults and youth. Approximately 20% of these grants were awarded to agencies and organizations serving the juvenile justice population. We're constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit www.csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. Also, please be sure to visit the website's new youth pages at csgjusticecenter.org/youth. The Juvenile Justice Project page, you'll find, provides an overview of CSG Justice Center's juvenile justice-specific work. On this page, you can learn about our juvenile justice-related activities and also access seminal publications and resources from the field on juvenile justice-specific topics. The Juvenile Reentry page provides the most current information and resources on what works to improve youth reentry outcomes and overall juvenile justice outcomes. Today's webinar will feature Josh Weber and Gwendolyn Dilworth. Josh directs the Juvenile Justice Program at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Ms. Dilworth is the Juvenile Justice Specialist at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, or OJJDP. Ms. Dilworth has nearly 30 years of experience in crime prevention, organizational development, project management, staff supervision, and instructional development and delivery. Ms. Dilworth joined the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention in 1999. In her capacity as a juvenile justice specialist, she oversees federally funded projects covering a wide range of complex and highly visible initiatives, cooperative agreements, and federal interagency agreements. Today's presentation will begin with a description of the goals of a specific grant program. I'll then provide an overview of the award details, eligibility, and target population. Josh will discuss program-specific details at greater length, and Ms. Dilworth will conclude with a brief breakdown of application details. Please note the content of this presentation will reflect the key aspects of the solicitation. So that said, it's important you read the full solicitation for complete details. The overarching goal of this grant program is to focus on reducing recidivism and improving key outcomes for youth involved in the juvenile justice system, including outcomes like behavioral health, education, connecting with families, etc. This new grant program, distinct from previous Second Chance Act programs, is nuanced in that grantees will be given a single award to first plan and then implement a comprehensive and collaborative strategy to improve youth reentry outcomes. It's important to note that reentry is a process that begins when the youth is first incarcerated and ends with his or her reintegration back into the community. The strategies developed and implemented in the strategic plan should advance the adoption, integration, and effective implementation of the principles and practices that research has shown to improve youth reentry outcomes. And you can find these best practices and policies in Appendix A of the full solicitation. The key area to highlight in this program is that agencies should be looking to plan and implement policies and practices that can be sustained over the long term as it pertains to confinement, reentry planning, and the release and reentry process. OJJDP will make awards under this program for as much as $750,000. The initial award period will be 24 months. Grantees may take as long as 6 months to complete their planning project. During the planning phase, grantees will have access to $50,000 for activities related to addressing the mandatory requirements in the planning phase deliverables. Once the planning phase is complete, and OJJDP has approved progress towards or completion of all deliverables, the grantee will gain access to the remaining award balance of as much as $700,000. Grantees will then be able to proceed to the implementation phase and complete project activities. OJJDP may make as many as 15 awards this fiscal year under this specific program. Eligible applicants are limited to states, including territories, units of local government, and federally recognized Indian tribal governments as determined by the Secretary of the Interior. Note that government agencies with direct oversight of juvenile confinement, reentry, and parole aftercare are best positioned to implement the Second Chance Act program. Government agencies without this direct oversight are strongly encouraged to partner with or obtain executive-level letters of support, memorandums of understanding from each of the agencies as part of their grant application. Your target population should be youth currently held in secure confinement facilities such as a juvenile detention center, juvenile correctional facility, or staff secure facilities. The population must be a specific medium to high-risk subset of the population of youth held within the secure confinement facilities listed. Youth must be admitted to the program prior to their 18th birthday. However, award recipients may continue to implement a juvenile reentry plan for these individuals beyond their 18th birthday. OJJDP does not have a set timeline for terminating these services. Instead, they can continue as long as is deemed therapeutically necessary. I'll now turn this portion of the presentation over to Josh Weber, who will unpack some of the details pertaining to program-specific information in this grant program. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Liz, and good afternoon, everyone. One of the key aspects of this solicitation and one of the key goals is supporting jurisdictions to reduce recidivism and improve other key outcomes for youth in the juvenile justice system. The solicitation sets forth a very specific definition for how a jurisdiction should measure those outcomes. For both recidivism and other positive youth outcomes, jurisdictions are asked to establish baseline rates for those outcomes based on a historical comparison population, ideally disaggregated by youth risk level. For then each of those baselines, jurisdictions are then encouraged to identify ambitious, measurable, and achievable targets for improving upon those baseline rates, and to have the capacity to measure progress against those targets on an ongoing basis. OJJDP and the National Reentry Resource Center recognize that many jurisdictions may not be able to currently collect outcome data in this rigorous way. As part of the application process, however, jurisdictions are required to detail their current capacity to measure recidivism rates and other youth outcomes in this manner, and to work during the grant period, during the planning phase, as well as the implementation phase, to make significant progress towards being able to measure outcomes in the manner described. In support of achieving those outcomes, the Second Chance Act legislation sets forth 10 mandatory requirements of a comprehensive reentry program. Applicants are expected to demonstrate at least some progress around achieving these 10 mandatory requirements in their application, and will continue to work on achieving these requirements during both the planning and implementation phases of the grant. The first key mandatory requirement is the development of a juvenile reentry strategic plan that should describe the state or local jurisdiction's long-term reentry strategy and reentry goals. Even if your proposal is for a discrete set of service or policy or practice reforms, it's important that that juvenile reentry strategic plan speak to the larger jurisdiction-wide reforms that the grantee hopes to support through the reentry process through this grant. Second, the second mandatory requirement is a detailed reentry implementation schedule and sustainability plan for implementing those strategic priorities. Third is the development of a juvenile reentry task force that helps oversee the development of that plan, the coordination of reentry services, and the implementation and sustainability plan. As part of that reentry task force, there should be all of the key state and local juvenile justice agencies, as well as other government agencies, service providers, youth, families, and other key stakeholders that have a critical role to play in improving youth reentry outcomes. As part of the mandatory requirements, applicants should also provide documentation that reflects that the work of the reentry task force and the strategic planning process has the support of a chief executive officer, ideally of the juvenile correctional system, as well as other key policymakers and juvenile justice leaders throughout the jurisdiction. The eighth mandatory requirement requires grantees to describe their evidence-based methodology, services, and supports for producing the expected reentry outcome improvements. The ninth mandatory requirement focuses on how applicants will sustain and replicate project activities for a larger juvenile population if the activities have proven to be successful. And finally, the 10th requirement also requires that jurisdictions focus not only on improving the services and supports that are provided to youth while they're in confinement, as well as the reentry planning process, but also to make sure that youth can successfully reintegrate and return back to their homes and communities. As noted, this grant is divided into two separate phases. The first phase is a planning phase. The planning phase can last for up to 6 months, or for grantees that may have already received a planning grant in the past, or who have a more sophisticated set of reforms already underway, the planning period may be shorter. During the planning period, grantees will continue to work on implementing the mandatory requirements. In recognition that those requirements are comprehensive, there are a specific set of priority requirements and deliverables that all grantees will be expected to make at least a minimum amount of progress on during the planning phase. First, all grantees will be expected to have a reentry task force or committee to focus on juvenile reentry systems reform planning and implementation up and running by the end of the planning period. This requires grantees to identify all of the members of that task force, to secure their commitment and buy-in, to be clear about the roles, responsibilities, and expected outcomes of that task force, and to have policies and procedures in place for the role of that task force and how they will meet and work together to advance the reentry strategic plan on an ongoing basis. Second, at the end of the planning phase, all grantees will be expected to have developed a plan for measuring and tracking recidivism rates and other youth outcomes as per the standards described in this solicitation. Again, we recognize that not all jurisdictions will be able to meet all of the standards described in this solicitation, but it's the expectation that an outcome measurement and evaluation plan will be in place, either using internal capacity or partnering with external experts, so the impact of grant funding and the outcomes produced by it can be tracked over time. Third, all grantees will be expected to have a juvenile reentry strategic plan at least partially in place, recognizing that strategic planning is an ongoing process. To support the development of that strategic plan, grantees will receive support from the National Reentry Resource Center to conduct a guided self-assessment process. This system self-assessment will help grantees to identify their current system strengths and weaknesses compared to what research has shown works to improve youth reentry outcomes. Those principles and practices are detailed in Appendix A of the solicitation. The National Reentry Resource Center will also work with grantees during the planning phase to identify a set of priority policy and practice reforms that support improved reentry outcomes and that can provide a broader systems reform framework in conjunction with the specific implementation activities proposed during the implementation phase. Finally, during the planning phase, grantees are expected to have developed a specific implementation plan for how they will implement grant activities and priority reforms with clear timelines, tasks, and responsible parties identified, and also to establish the beginning of a sustainability plan for how these strategic planning and implementation efforts will be sustained after the grant period has ended. Once grantees have received approval from OJJDP as having met these deliverables and are able to move on to the implementation phase, grantees will then receive the bulk of their grant award to implement their identified activities. During the implementation phase, grantees are required to focus on advancing the policies and practices that are identified in Appendix A of the solicitation. Those principles and practices are really at the core of this Second Chance Act solicitation and what it takes to improve reentry outcomes. A brief summary of some of these include the use of validated assessment instruments to target high-risk youth and to guide supervision, service, release planning, and revocation decisions that are based upon youth's risks and criminogenic needs. The implementation of services and supports that have been proven by rigorous research to reduce recidivism and improve other key youth outcomes for high-risk youth offenders. Improving the coordination of service delivery, release planning, and reentry across the many different systems in which youth are or should be involved, including the juvenile justice system, the behavioral health system, the education system, and the child welfare system. Using grant dollars to improve the engagement of youth in designing and shaping system interventions and being a part of case planning processes, as well as engaging families in the therapeutic and reentry process while youth are in confinement, as well as upon their return back to the community. Implementing more developmentally appropriate interventions under the recognition that youth are developmentally different from adults, and require a different set of supports and services to support their outcomes. Those might include supervision policy and practice changes, like the use of a graduated response system to youth violations, or training facility and supervision staff in practices such as youth engagement, motivational interviewing, and cognitive behavioral therapy. Next is an emphasis on quality assurance and improvement processes and support. Research has clearly shown that how well an intervention is implemented is just as, if not more important, to improve youth outcomes as the substance of the particular policy and practice. As a result, applicants are encouraged to identify specific quality assurance, quality improvement, and data collection processes and supports that they will implement as part of the grant process to ensure that the reentry systems reforms that they are proposing have the intended positive result. Next, applicants and grantees are encouraged to provide training for staff as part of the quality assurance and readiness process on any of these policies and practices, and to think about the ongoing systems and supports that can help make sure that facility and community and supervision staff are prepared to meet these comprehensive reentry needs. And finally, as part of that process, applicants and grantees are encouraged to think about strategies to connect youth with needed health and behavioral health services. In addition to an emphasis on the principles and practices identified in Appendix A, as well as a more rigorous structure around measuring recidivism rates and other improved youth outcomes, there are an additional set of priority considerations for this solicitation. A number of those priority considerations that are listed in the Second Chance Act solicitation are those required by the Second Chance Act legislation. In addition to those required priority considerations, OJJDP has identified a number of additional considerations that it will particularly look for as part of the application process. A set of those priority considerations apply to all applicants, and those include, first, the capacity to measure recidivism rates and other youth outcomes in the manner described in the solicitation. Applicants that can demonstrate that they have this capacity already in place and are well positioned to track and measure whether grant activities are resulting in significant and sustained improvements to youth outcomes will receive priority consideration. Second, as mentioned a number of times, a priority consideration for this solicitation is applicants who identify that they will advance the principles and practices listed in Appendix A of the solicitation that have proven to have a long-term impact on youth reoffending. And then third, a priority for OJJDP and the field is making sure that grant funds are used not simply to provide additional services or supports to a specific juvenile population, but that grant activities result in sustainable changes to the juvenile reentry policy and practice. As a result, grantees and applicants who are able to document the likelihood that grant activities will result in these sustainable changes and that funding will be available to sustain activities after the award has ended will be well positioned to potentially receive an award. Next, OJJDP is looking for a subset of applicants to focus their Second Chance Award on some specific issues and areas of priority around juvenile reentry. All applicants do not need to feel like they have to propose activities in these areas, but OJJDP will look to make a select set of awards in these areas. The first is the improvement of educational services while youth are in confinement, improving the transition process and the school re-enrollment process from confinement to an appropriate community school in a timely and effective manner, and supporting youth educational and vocational success when they are back in the community. Second is looking for applicants who propose improved identification of youth mental health and or substance abuse disorders, who provide evidence-based services to youth while they're in confinement to address those disorders, and who support and advance a continuity of care for treating those disorders from the point of confinement back to the community. Finally, OJJDP will look to make a select number of awards for jurisdictions that focus on a transitional age youth or older adolescent population. These are youth who may be looking for educational and vocational success when they return back to the community, who may be looking to separate from their families and approaching economic independence, who may be looking for their own housing. And research has shown that there are not a lot of good models for how to best support these transition-age youth return back to the community. And so applicants who prioritize and identify a model for supporting those youth needs that's based in research and lessons learned will also receive priority consideration.
Thanks, Josh. So we'll now hear from Ms. Dilworth from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, who will review some of the key application details. Thanks for joining us, Gwen.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Let's look at the collaboration with other federal agencies. This has been mentioned in large part already. I'll just repeat that the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and the Bureau of Justice Assistance are working in partnership on the Second Chance Act, both from a juvenile and adult reentry perspective. OJJDP and BJA are also working with the National Institute of Justice to support the research and evaluation of activities called for in the Act. And some of our current grantees are actually participating in those evaluations. You've already heard from the staff of the National Reentry Resource Center, who will be an integral part of the success of those applicants who are selected for this particular solicitation. They will provide intensive and targeted technical assistance to ensure your success, of the success of those applicants who are selected for this award. I'm sure as you have listened to the staff speak, you've probably wondered, gosh, you know, we don't have all of these capabilities yet, and I'm not sure we can indicate how we move. Well, we can indicate how we would move forward, but we may not have all of the skills and capabilities that may be necessary based on the plan that is developed. And if the application is selected, the National Reentry Resource Center is a tremendous source of support in helping those who are selected achieve their goals and objectives. Under the mandatory requirements, Josh has done a great job of explaining and describing what those are. The only thing I will add is to encourage you to look at page 36 of the application, to use the 8 fundamental principles, or include some of the fundamental principles that are described there as you prepare your application. Another consideration is how the project could be replicated if it is shown to be effective. Another discussion point would be around a plan to review barriers that impeded the integration of juveniles into the community and how you might address that. In relation to deliverables for the planning and implementation phases, That information can be found on page 10 and 11, and Josh has discussed that. I will simply refer you to the section on priority considerations that are discussed also on pages 12 and 13, and remind you that you are not required to address each one in your application. I'm going to switch phones real quickly, so just bear with me 1 minute. Okay, sorry about that. In relation to the budget information, you've already heard that the amount of the award will be up to $750,000 for a 24-month period, and that there may be up to 15 awards that will be made. You've also listened to discussion on the 2 phases of this program, the planning and implementation phases. If you've read the application, you know that up to $50,000 can be used to initiate a 6-month planning process. After that time, the plans will be reviewed, and once they are approved, then the remainder of the $700,000 will be released to those programs that have been selected for this particular announcement. In terms of preparing for the budget, you must indicate how you will allot the match requirement to the overall budget. Be sure to clearly identify matching funds in the budget, showing all calculations and computations. Our support staff have received a number of calls regarding the calculation for the match. The calculation is included in the application packet, and I urge you to please follow that formula. It's very specific, and it will help you make sure that your calculations are correct. For questions pertaining to the budget and examples of allowable and unallowable costs, I'm going to refer you to the Office of Justice Programs Financial Guide, which can be found on the website that is listed in the application packet. To assist you with the budget detail worksheet, there is a sample that can be found on the website that's mentioned again in the application packet. It's very, very important that you follow that format. If you don't use the budget sample that is included on the website, then the budget that you use must follow that format. I can't underscore that enough. Another part of the budget is the budget narrative, which describes how you came up with the calculations and how the funds will be used and how they're cost effective and how they will be used to help you implement the program in a cost effective manner. And again, you can find examples on our website, which is included in the package. There are 5 key sections to the application that must be completed. The first one is an abstract, which will describe in 400 words or less what you intend to do, and in a summary format of the proposed project. The narrative addresses sections related to statement of the problem, the goals and objectives and performance measures for your proposal, the program design and implementation strategy, and finally the capabilities and competencies. In other words, capabilities and competencies are your description of how you feel you are best qualified to do this grant, and the qualifications that you have to implement the program itself. For example, you can derive your goals and objectives directly from the problems to be addressed. Similarly, the project design section should clearly explain how the program's activities and structure will accomplish the goals and objectives identified in that section. I've already discussed the budget, the importance of the budget worksheet and following that format. And I'll just reiterate that the budget narrative should thoroughly and clearly describe every category of expense listed in the budget detail worksheet. The Office of Justice Programs expects proposed budgets to be complete, cost-effective, and allowable. You should describe also how you will maximize cost-effectiveness of grant expenditures. Budget narratives should generally describe the cost in relation to the goals and objectives. In other words, when we review the applications, we're going to be looking to see if the budget and the goals and objectives correlate with one another so that we can see how costs have been projected and how they will be used to implement the actual grant. Performance measures are used to meet certain requirements, the GIPA requirement for the Office of Justice Programs, and it also gives us an indication of how you are progressing toward your goals and objectives, how you are accomplishing those tasks in relation to when you said you would accomplish them, either through your benchmarks or your logic plan or your timeline. So it's very, very important that all of these things are described in your application. Let's see. Reviewing the criteria for selection, I mentioned the statement of the problem, the goals and objectives and performance measures, the project design and implementation strategies, capabilities and competencies, and the budget. Each one of these receive a score, a ranking that is used to determine your score. So if you look at page 1 of the application, it will go into much more detail than I'm able to go into during this call, describing the content that needs to be included in your application. And finally, the review process. The first thing that will happen is we have a contractor who reviews each application to make sure that it meets the basic minimum requirements. Within your application packet, those factors are discussed. So you want to make sure that you read those carefully. We select either internal or external reviewers who review the application based on its merits and make recommendations. Those recommendations go forward to the administrator, and the ultimate decision for funding is made by the Assistant Attorney General. Just one other step. Where the budget is reviewed, OJJDP works with our Chief Financial Officer Department, and this is why the budget narrative is so critical, because they review those portions of the application, and they provide feedback to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention on the fiscal integrity and financial capabilities of each candidate. So all of those go into consideration all those factors are part of the consideration in the review process. There are additional requirements that you may want to take a look at on page 31, and then on page 32 are your instructions on how to apply. Once you begin the application process, you may have a number of questions that may come up today or may not arise until you're actually in the process of preparing the application. There is a number that you can call, and that's grants.gov Customer Support Hotline at 800-518-4726 or 606-545-5035. Or you can reach them at support@grants.gov. They're available 24/7 except federal holidays. So for questions regarding the solicitation, you can contact them. That information is also on the front page of the application packet, and you can see it right on the bottom of the page. And so, let me see. I think that's where I will stop, Liz.
Great. Thanks, Gwen. I appreciate that. So finally, just before we get into questions and answers, I wanted to note some key next steps. So all applications are due on June 2nd, and you can find details around that under Deadlines Registration Application page in page 4. Please be aware that you must register with grants.gov prior to submitting an application, so please be sure to allow sufficient time for the full process. And you can learn more about that process on how to apply on page 32 of the full solicitation. And then also note that OJJDP has included an important notice about applying for grants in grants.gov, so be sure to read that carefully in advance. And on this slide, which you'll receive following the presentation, you'll see a link to the full solicitation if you haven't seen it already. So this portion of the presentation will be devoted to addressing some of the questions that we received throughout the webinar. If you have a question and you haven't shared it yet, feel free to do so by typing it into the box in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. So we received one question that was, if I am a current Second Chance Act grantee, which of the current FY2014 Second Chance Act programs are most applicable to me? The recent Systems Reform Grant Program or the Planning and Implementation Grant Program? So what's important to note here is when you think about which grant program to apply for, it's important to note the distinction between the two programs. The Systems Reform Grant Program requires more systems readiness and capacity and, in general, buy-in to implement that comprehensive change to juvenile reentry policies and practices. So it's looking at it from more of a large-scale systemic perspective. So that's the key piece to note when you're thinking about where you are in your agency and what's most appropriate for you. Josh or Gwen, did you want to add anything to that response?
Only that if grantees have a current Second Chance Act award and are still going to be providing services under that grant during the time of the new award, then it might be difficult for grantees to get a second award. Grantees who have already received the planning award and the planning award will have ended by the time of the new grant are likely well positioned, given success of that planning phase, to apply for this grant program.
Great. And as Josh said earlier, that Second Chance Act grantees will be positioned to have already implemented some of those planning deliverables, so that planning process may be shorter, given that. This question is directed, I guess, to Josh, to anyone. Josh, you spoke a bit about the importance of having a strong reentry task force in place. So this question relates to, saying my agency already has a governing body that oversees juvenile justice issues more broadly. Can this body serve as our juvenile reentry task force? And if not, what would make this task force distinct for this project?
So the answer to that is yes, as long as part of that group's work is specifically focused on reentry, and given the specific members required in the reentry task force that are listed in the solicitation, that those members are part of that juvenile justice group. Based on our experience, we've seen pluses and minuses with that approach. It's certainly worthwhile to build upon an existing structure, but you also want to make sure that that structure is functioning effectively and there can be appropriate attention to reentry. So folks can use an existing committee or collaboration for this purpose, but we'll just need to detail how to make sure that focus on reentry is there and that structure serves them as an effective vehicle for advancing all of the mandatory requirements.
Great. Thank you. So another question that came in was with regards to this strategic plan and implementation of this plan, what are some of the things juveniles will learn or participate in within the reintegration phase? And I would say that, this reintegration phase is really focused, again, on advancing those key policies and practices that improve outcomes for youth across the continuum. So the point of intake through the youth's return home. And those policies and practices are really comprehensively implemented at all those different key decision points. And Josh spoke about some of those earlier. That can include a youth receiving validated assessment instruments, which includes behavioral health screenings and assessments. That includes a youth and his or her family being engaged across all those key decision points, incorporating a developmentally appropriate approach to how staff works with youth. And again, those full list of policy practices can be found in Appendix A of the solicitation, but it's really integrating those from beginning to end. Josh or Gwen, did you want to add anything to that?
No, other than in terms of the specific support or the specific type of services that youth receive, that's really up to the jurisdiction to identify how they would most like to use those funds. But as Liz has mentioned, we would want to see evidence in the application that jurisdictions are making those service decisions based on what research and evidence has shown works, and also based upon the results of validated assessments that show youth-specific risks and criminogenic needs, and that the services and supports that you receive are matched to those needs.
Great. Thank you. So another question that came in is, when applying, should we specifically note that we are looking at targeting one of the subset areas, such as education services or mental health?
So the answer to that is only if that is the focus of your application. So as noted, OJJDP will be looking to make a subset of the total awards that focus on those specific priority issue areas, but not all of the awards will focus on those areas. But if applicants are specifically going to focus on one of those areas, then it should be very clear through the application and the proposed set of planning and implementation activities that one of those priority areas is the area of focus.
Okay. Great. Excellent. Thank you. Another question, I guess, be directed to Josh or Gwen. Is there a mandatory amount of time a youth must be in confinement to be eligible for this particular grant program?
No, the youth must be in custody or confinement at the time of application. And the application actually addresses that once the questioner looks at it, that the child has to be under 17 at the time of confinement, but once if they're confined at the time, if an award is made, then there is no limit on age of service, for service.
Great.
And I think the solicitation does not identify a specific number of days or length of time that a youth has to be in a facility. But generally, the grant program is focused on reentry processes, and so would not be appropriate, for example, for youth who are detained overnight because they're awaiting adjudication. It's looking at youth who have a longer-term sentence in a facility, and therefore more substantial efforts are needed to support their successful reintegration back to the community.
Great, thank you. So another one of the questions that came in was around eligibility of nonprofit agencies. And the answer to that is nonprofit agencies are not directly eligible, but again, agencies can partner with a government agency to apply for this grant program. To address that. Another question that came in was around eligibility age for youth. There's a question around youth being able to be eligible from up to 17 or 18. The answer to that is, youth must be enrolled prior to age 18, but services can continue after age 18, and that can be determined by the agency. So I'll allow a couple of more minutes for questions to come in from participants. In the meantime, Gwen or Josh, is there anything you wanted to add?
No.
Okay. Great. All right. So I'll wait another minute or so for questions to come in. All right. Well, if there are additional questions, please note that Gwen Dilworth did provide some numbers and an email address you can use to follow up after the close of the webinar. And again, you'll receive a copy of this webinar moving forward. So this does conclude today's webinar. After you exit the webinar, a brief survey is going to appear on your screen. And so by answering the questions in the survey, you'll be helping the National Reentry Resource Center improve on the services we offer. So we greatly appreciate it if you would just take a few minutes to complete that survey. We'll email a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a link to a PDF of the PowerPoint slides used in the presentation early next week. And links will also be made available on the National Reentry Resource Center's website, which is www.csujusticecenter.org/NRC. And again, just a reminder to please subscribe to the National Reentry Resource Center's newsletter at csujusticecenter.org/subscribe if you haven't done so already. And I want to thank everyone for your participation in the webinar this afternoon, and I hope you all have a great day. Thanks.